I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. This week, I'll ask author David Sanger of the Times about his new book, The New Cold Wars. We'll discuss America's return to its former Cold War rivalries with Russia and China. But first, Democrats continue to nervously await November's election. There may be some hope for them on one issue, abortion. New York Times editorial board member Mara Gay went to Florida to investigate how Democrats there are leaning into the issue to win back legislative seats in the state and test the influence of Donald Trump. Mara, you went to Florida recently and you found out that Democrats there are trying to rally behind abortion as an issue. Are they going to succeed?
Well, the Democrats in Florida are in a desperate state. Republicans are in control of the governor's office. They have a supermajority in the legislature. And they're basically on a tear. They're building a broad coalition. They have a huge voter registration advantage in the state as well. So what the Democrats are trying to do is they're looking at this House seat that they flipped in Central Florida. Tom Keene won in January in a special election. The issue in that race was far and away abortion rights. There is a new 6-week ban on abortion in the state that the Republicans in the supermajority have passed. It's very unpopular in Florida polls. So the Democrats are trying to see how far they can push that issue with voters and others to see if they can chip away at the supermajority. They're looking at least 5 seats that they believe they can flip to end the Republican supermajority and regain a toehold in power in the state.
How is that going to impact on the presidential race in Florida, if at all?
It may not have an impact on the presidential race. It's certainly possible. I mean, these Democrats believe that the state really is truly a swing state and that the Democratic Party in Florida has been, beset by infighting. They've had a really hard time registering voters, doing the kind of on-the-ground organizing that Democrats in states like Georgia have done very well. So Florida is behind. So they aren't thinking that they're going to put the state in play in time for this November election. At the same time, they do believe that abortion is hugely motivating. The fear in Florida is that there are so many Republicans in Florida who may actually vote for the ballot initiative in November to restore abortion rights, but may split that ticket and then vote for President Trump and Republicans down the line as well.
With an issue like that on the ballot, and it's on the ballot in other states too, an equal rights amendment or the equivalent, explain to me how the Republicans are still sticking to an anti-abortion stand, regardless of the way one actually feels about abortion rights.
It's a great question, Sam, which really leads me to a more disturbing part of the reporting experience I had in Florida, which we think of as land of Disney World, land of beaches, and it is that. It's also a deeply southern state. And this is a case where you have a Republican Party that is not only winning elections in Florida, but is now using the power it has to erect barriers to political competition and civic participation across Florida. These are the kinds of barriers that we saw before the civil rights movement, which really was democratization in other southern states. So it's not quite back there to one-party rule yet, but they are taking measures to make it harder to vote, to make it impossible to implement ballot initiatives passed by Floridians, like one several years ago that would have re-enfranchised felons. They're making it, in fact, the former GOP chairman, who's now a state senator in Florida, last year introduced a bill to abolish the Democratic Party altogether based on its previous support 160 years ago of slavery.
It didn't get anywhere, I assume.
Didn't get anywhere, but these are the kind of measures that we're seeing. They also, actually, the Republicans in the supermajority this year completely eliminated, through gerrymandering, redistricting, a majority black seat in northern Florida. And so they really are trying to solidify their hold on power because at this point, their agenda is not actually very popular with voters, starting with abortion.
Mary, you point out in your Times reporting that in Florida, Governor DeSantis and the legislature restrict critical treatment for transgender Americans. They're targeting unions. They're easing gun laws. They're making it easier to impose the death penalty, banning books, banning the teaching of black history. Is this a template for what a second Trump administration would look like?
I fear it is. It's hard when you are traveling and visiting with people and talking to voters. In the midst of that kind of environment, you realize what a chilling effect some of these measures can have, how anti-democratic many of them are. For example, just interviewing voters, people were terrified to have their photograph taken. They didn't want to come out of their homes. There have been neo-Nazis marching openly in military regalia in some of these swing districts. And on top of that, Governor DeSantis started his own police force, an elections police unit, and has arrested dozens of Floridians on charges of voter fraud. Now, those cases have very rarely resulted in anything but a slap on the wrist. In fact, usually they've turned out to be much ado about nothing, but it has a chilling effect. And so this is essentially a cautionary tale, I believe, of what a kind of MAGA rule could look like if it's ultimately unchecked.
It may seem counterintuitive, maybe not, but why is the Democrat strength, Biden's strength, ebbing or not that as strong as you might think it would be among Latinos and also among blacks, black men, as you pointed out in particular?
Yeah, I mean, that's a question that obviously, as you know, Sam, it really is a nationwide question. And I don't know the answer to that. I've been traveling across the country in the past 6 months talking to Democratic voters in that coalition. You know, there's a sense that Joe Biden is deeply unpopular. There's also a sense of anger right now about Gaza among many of these voters. So I've spoken to black voters who say, well, things in my life are more expensive. They haven't gotten much better. But now I'm watching the U.S. spend billions of dollars on a campaign to aid Israel, bombing women and children, in their view, and I have no problem with these people. So we're spending billions on a war, and I'm not getting help.
Are they saying the same thing about aiding Ukraine?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So I think there's definitely a consistency. I guess you heard this during Vietnam, which is, what about folks here at home? I think there's some anger about that. But I also think, listen, at the end of the day, black voters, Hispanic voters, Latino voters, all Americans, all voters, all humans are susceptible to the same kind of disinformation campaigns and to the same kind of erosion in trust in institutions that a Republican voter may be susceptible to. So I think the Democrats just can't take anything for granted. Now, many of these voters are not necessarily saying they're going to go vote for Trump. They are just expressing at this point, I believe in the polls, anger toward Biden, a vote of no confidence toward the Democratic Party that they feel has underdelivered for them and their communities, but yet asked a lot of them consistently to show up. So I think there's a lot of anger, and there's also a lot of disgust about both of the candidates being older and out of touch. I've heard that over and over again. You have folks under 40 who are struggling to buy homes, who are struggling to make ends meet, who aren't doing as well as their parents did. So there's a generational concern brewing here as well for the Democrats.
You wrote not long ago that Kamala Harris was beginning to make her case as a candidate separate from Joe Biden. Is she making that case, and is she an asset to the ticket now or a liability?
Oh, no. The vice president is clearly an asset, in my view, to the campaign. Part of that is because she is younger, very youthful. She's drawing larger crowds than she did when she was running her own campaign for the presidency in 2020. It's really quite an interesting reversal. She seems very comfortable on the campaign trail. I've watched her several times now, and in Las Vegas especially, it was kind of amazing to see the response that she was getting from exactly the voters that Joe Biden needs to bring back home into the party to win this election, which is younger voters, which is black voters, Hispanic voters, and voters who are really concerned about abortion rights.
But you're not seeing at those rallies the voters who worry that something will happen to Joe Biden and Kamala Harris will become president. They don't go to the rallies.
You're saying people who are worried about Kamala Harris being president don't go to Kamala Harris?
You wouldn't see them at the rallies.
Sure, but I guess I'm not sure what the concern is about Kamala Harris being president.
Are they worried that she would become president, and that's a fear that they have, that she's not up to the job?
I think she's definitely come into her own. And I think she's a much better campaigner than she was. Now, whether she's ready to be president, I mean, she's definitely been taking on additional briefings. They've made no secret of that because, of course, everyone is aware of Joe Biden's age. That's something that's just a responsible thing to do. And so from that perspective, she's been doing more national security briefings, beefing up just in case. But I think she's certainly more ready now than she was 4 years ago.
And you could ask, is anyone ready to be
There you
president?
go.
For sure. Did you find people are angry at Biden? They're not sure about voting for Trump. Is there any groundswell for Robert Kennedy, for a third party?
I haven't seen it. There's a lot of hunger for a different option. And I do think that we have to contextualize these polls that look really bad for Joe Biden right now, with the caveat that for most Americans, they're not politics junkies like you and I. And so they're really not necessarily going to engage until the end of the summer,
until they're
Labor
forced
Day,
to.
Until they're forced to. They're weary, they're exhausted by politics. So I think once a lot of voters really plug into the fact that Donald Trump will be the only other option, there will be some boost, I believe, that Joe Biden will get with that. And that's just based on my anecdotal experience of interviewing at this point hundreds of voters across the country. A lot of people have said to me, is Donald Trump really going to be the nominee? And so as that becomes clear, yes, I do believe that many Americans will show up to the polls out of that concern. They don't want to see another Donald Trump presidency.
Mara, a very quick local question. How vulnerable do you think Mayor Adams is if he seeks re-election?
It's very difficult for an incumbent mayor to lose, but we've seen it before with Dave Dinkins. It can happen again.
And Abe Beame.
And Abe Beame. And I do think that Adams is vulnerable to the right challenger.
Okay, good answer. Thanks to Mara Gay of the New York Times for joining us and for her coverage. Coming up next, America's new Cold Wars, just like the old one, but different. My next guest is Pulitzer Prize-winning White House and national security correspondent with over 40 years of experience at the New York Times. David Sanger's latest book, The New Cold Wars: China's Rise, Russia's Invasion, and America's Struggle to Defend the West. He leverages his extensive expertise and access to examine America's return to old superpower rivalries with Russia and China. What choices and risks lie ahead for the U.S.? The New York Times Book Review said this is a cogent, revealing account of how a generation of American officials have grappled with dangerous developments in the post-Cold War era. David, they've grappled with it. How successfully?
Well, not terribly successfully in the phases that we've seen so far, Sam. The new Cold Wars, that S at the end is important because what we are now engaged in is something dramatically different from the old Cold War. The old Cold War was primarily a military conflict with one adversary, the old Soviet Union. It was terrifying at moments, particularly the Cuban Missile Crisis. But eventually it settled into something of a predictable kind of confrontation. One where we knew the players on the other side, they knew the players on our side. There was a red phone on each desk. You knew who you were likely to talk to when you picked it up. In the new Cold Wars, it's far more complex. We have Russia and China operating sometimes together, sometimes independently. Iran and North Korea acting in their orbit and supporting, of course, the war in Ukraine. We have China as not only a military competitor, but a technological competitor and a political competitor for influence around the world, and able to leverage their enormous networks of products, software, think TikTok, but not only TikTok, to gain their nature of power. So it's a much more volatile combination than in the old Cold War, and the book argues, therefore, a far more dangerous and unpredictable one.
David, I thought the fear of terrorism and the economic benefits of globalization were going to make everybody get along.
Yeah, it was supposed to, Sam. That was the theory when I returned from my happy life as a foreign correspondent in Japan and washed up in Washington 30 years ago in 1994. And at the time that I got here to Washington, the assumption was that Russia and China, each for their own very different reasons, would see a tremendous advantage in just signing on to the Western system. Russia needed a market for its oil and gas, and Europe was the natural target for that. China needed markets for all of its goods. And, you know, Americans have a wonderful way of projecting our interests on other countries. And the way we did that in the case of Russia and China was just assume that their economic interests would triumph over any of their territorial interests, any of their interests in settling old scores left from Mao's revolution that created the People's Republic, but also ended up creating an offshoot rebellious island of Taiwan, that Russia would simply accept its new borders and not try to pull back some of the old Soviet republics. And so the first 150 pages of the book or so, Sam, is basically an explanation of how we got that wrong, with a mix of bad intelligence, of wishful thinking, and of this projection that their interests would be the same as our interests.
David, you point out in the book that this is a case now of interests, the priority rather than ideology. But weren't we always governed by interests, by nationalism over, say, democracy or communism?
So usually nations' interests are, in fact, what rules. What we've seen happen in China's case is that the ideology of communism has fallen away to one of what's the most profitable way to operate the country for citizens. But that has meant that they've lost a lot of their cohesion along the way. And for Russia, communism long ago gave way to an authoritarian instinct. So it's kind of funny in the campaign where you hear former President Trump sometimes denounce his rivals as communists, as if he was living back in the 1950s, when in fact ideology is a very small component of what's going on now, unless you consider authoritarian rule to be an ideological form.
David, you point out in the book that Trump and Biden were following this pretty much the same policy when it comes to China. Where are the differences between the two of them in terms of foreign policy?
So President Trump, you may remember, imposed tariffs like mad, but then promised to lift them if he could just reach that one big deal. And you'll remember he was so obsessed with trade deals with China that at one point he told Xi Jinping, China's president, oh, don't worry, I won't mention what's going on in Hong Kong in the midst of all the crackdowns that were taking place there at the time, if we can just reach our deal. President Biden has approached this with maintaining many of the same Trump-era tariffs, because lifting them would seem like a unilateral act. He'd have to get something in return. It's not clear the Chinese were ready to go offer that. What Biden has done, I think, much more skillfully than Trump ever did, was impose a series of technological export controls, particularly on advanced semiconductors, so that China does not get the equipment to make the chips that are the key for artificial intelligence, military applications, and so forth. And meanwhile, through an industrial policy in the United States, has been building up the American, or rebuilding the American ability to produce those advanced semiconductors. My concern, as you'll see at the end of the book, is that we're not doing the latter part of that fast enough. And that even under the most optimistic projections, we would still be dependent on China and Taiwan for 80% of the most advanced semiconductors in 2030. That's not a good place to be if you think that the timeline for a confrontation over Taiwan could fit within that time period.
David, I read a column by Bret Stephens the other day in the Times that said that in effect, he didn't say it in as many words, we are aiding Israel, we are aiding Ukraine, but they are fighting sort of with one hand tied behind their back, the way we did in the wars that we lost in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, elsewhere. Does that seem to be realistic?
Well, I agree with part of that. Certainly in Ukraine, we have put restraints on the Ukrainians. And in recent days, I've been writing a lot about the fierce debate underway within the White House about whether to allow the Ukrainians to fire American-provided weapons, artillery, missiles, and so forth, into Russian territory, since the Russians are attacking Ukraine from the safety of that territory. For the 27 months of the war, Sam, the U.S. has had a prohibition put in place by President Biden on firing into Russia, even if it's at a military emplacement. And that's becoming somewhat untenable. And Secretary of State Antony Blinken told the president that after he returned from Kyiv a few weeks ago. There's risk, though, here. Let's face it. Russia is a nuclear power. So far, it has not used its nuclear weapons against Ukraine, even tactical battlefield weapons, but it's been threatened on more than one occasion. And there is a red line out there someplace where I think Putin actually might use them. We just don't know exactly where that line is. So this is really playing with fire. In the Mideast, it's a little more complicated. I think our fear about Israel right now is that they have used too much firepower against innocent civilians and not enough targeted firepower against Hamas.
So how do we solve the Middle East crisis? Or don't we?
Well, first of all, it may not be ours to solve. You know, one of the characteristics of the U.S. in the post-World War II era was we took on every project around the world and viewed ourselves as a solution. But the Mideast has defied that. And in the end, you're not going to get to a two-state solution of a independent Israel and an independent Palestinian state with the current Israeli leadership. Prime Minister Netanyahu has been quite clear about his opposition to a two-state solution. So if you think the two-state solution is the only way out of this, it's not going to be within our power to do that until the Israelis change their government and until the Palestinians get their act together. They are divided between, obviously, Hamas and a weak Palestinian Authority, and they're going to need a single voice as well. So we need to understand a little bit about the limits of our power for a while as well.
And given the death of the president, is anything likely to change in Iran?
So we are in for an era of change in Iran. We just don't know which way it's going, harder right or more liberal. President Raisi's death in the helicopter crash was a huge surprise. And of course, he's the number 2 official. The number 1 leader in Iran is Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader. He's 85, reported at various moments to have some forms of slow-growing cancer. At that age, he's not going to keep ruling the country forever. The problem is if you have a leadership vacuum there, it gives power to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And guess what? They run the Iranian nuclear program.
David Sanger of the New York Times, his latest book, New Cold Wars: China's Rise, Russia's Invasion, and America's Struggle to Defend the West. Thank you for joining us. Coming up next, my thoughts on the re-election of Eric Adams. The Democratic mayoral primary is fully a year away. Ranked voting makes the outcome less predictable, and cell phones, citizen disengagement, and antipathy to polls in general have made voter surveys more inaccurate than ever. Still, in the middle of his third year as mayor, Eric Adams should be worried, very worried. One reason is a recent poll by the Manhattan Institute. The Institute is a respected conservative think tank, so let's say the sampling or some other factor in its latest voter survey might be a bit skewed. There's no way to explain away the vast margins, though. Nearly 7 in 10 New Yorkers say the city is headed in the wrong direction. They're concerned about the cost of housing and about crime. Only people in their 20s think we need fewer police officers. They fear an infinite influx of migrants. 4 in 10 say foreigners who arrived illegally should be deported. But a slim majority also support their right to be sheltered by the city. Voters could care less, as we say in Brooklyn, about schools, mass transit, and even the economy. It's never fair to match an incumbent against anyone but him, but the Manhattan Institute did just that with Adams. Its poll found that 16% of prospective voters would support him. Only 1 in 4 approve of the mayor's performance, including only 3 in 10 Democrats. I searched in vain for a silver lining for the West Wing of City Hall. Adams has a year to compile a record. Incumbency is powerful. Rivals may split the vote. But at this point, the mayor's approval rating in the city is even lower than Donald Trump's. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.